Hey class, welcome to lesson number 20. We're continuing microeconomics. We're going to nail this out in a couple lessons and then we'll move on to macroeconomics. So that being said, in the last class we went over longer and average cost. That was a big concept that we covered. Right behind me is a beautiful graph, right, of the longer and average cost. We said that there were three particular parts to it, right? The decreasing part is the economies of scale, right? And this is where the producer faces lowering costs as he or she expands, right? So that's a pretty cool thing because that's the biggest incentive for producers to expand by themselves, because with lower costs they can face higher profits. So economies of scale was a huge concept that we talked about in the last class, and extremely important in economics. Next part is constant returns to scale, right, where it's sort of flattened out in the LRAC. The last part is diseconomies of scale, where the costs actually start to take off. So that being said, we covered economies of scale. Today we're trying to talk about constant returns to scale and diseconomies of scale. Now, what's the reason why we face a constant returns to scale? Part of the reason is that the argument goes, and part of these models are actually seen from data as well, but the argument goes that when you have this producer, right, who has gone through the entire part of the economies of scale, he's faced, he's become more efficient, he's become more specialized, right, and so they've brought those costs down. The argument goes, at some point they've hit their max, right, efficiency. Now, the argument against that, of course, is technology, right? Technology is constantly changing in this world and whatnot. So, we can talk about that later on in class, how that affects it. But for now, if you disregard, advanced technology or whatever, the point is that at some point the producer has, maxed out in the way he or she is efficient and specialized, okay? So for a period of time when they start to produce more, right, their costs are kind of down. They don't change much, okay? There's not much variation in this part, okay, of constant returns to scale, which is pretty cool, right, if you think about it, because you're selling more products, right? As you move along this line, right, you're selling more products, your costs aren't changing, right? So remember, in our profit equation, right, which I'll just point over here, right, real quick, profit, right, which pi, right, profit is equal to your total revenue, right, minus your total cost, right? Now this could be explicit cost and implicit cost. We covered that in the last class, but one of the previous classes. But total revenue, if you break it down, right, is price times quantity, right? Remember that. So, this is the price you're selling at. This is how many you're selling. Now, in the constant returns to scale part, right, in this area right here, quantity is increasing, right, because you're actually moving to the right, along this line. So quantity is increasing, and total costs, right, if you look at the costs, they aren't changing much, so they stay constant. So what happens is your profit, right, actually goes up, correct? So your profit actually goes up. So that's why constant returns to scale is also a very cool part, right? So it's that the main argument is that, in terms of efficiency and specialization, we've kind of maxed it out. There's not much we can do to kind of lower the costs, but the cool part is we get to keep those low costs at that rate, and we get to increase the quantity, and so our profits actually increase, right? So producers do like this area. Now is the part that they don't like, right? So there is this part in the LRAC model, right, after we pass the constant returns to scale, where in the right-hand side of this parabola, right, the slope actually starts to accelerate, starts to take off. Now, this is called the diseconomies of scale, okay? Right here, right, diseconomies of scale. Now, why does diseconomies of scale happen? Okay, diseconomies of scale, there's a lot of arguments that why this particular thing takes place, but there's a couple of things. One is that as you grow, right, so you become, by now you're producing a lot, right? Obviously you're in an area, you're a quantity where you're producing a lot, you're a very, very big player. It could be, one of the arguments says that communication becomes a problem, right? One of the examples you can talk about and argue is, a couple of the banks, right? So if you take Citibank, right, before the economic meltdown, a lot of things were inefficient, right? They're really inefficient because there's a lack of communication. Maybe there's a lot of people who are doing the same work, right, who shouldn't have been there, right? And what the economic crisis did was it required the company to look back again and say, okay, where can we cut the fat and become more efficient, right? So communication can be a huge issue when you have a really big company, right? And again, as I said before, technology is that one thing we're constantly trying to bridge the gap, right? So we're trying to, obviously today we have a lot of cool communication gadgets that we can use to improve communication, but nevertheless, even a big company like, for instance, Citibank, and I don't want to be quoted on this, but I'm just giving you guys an example, right? Is that when you have a huge company, communication can be an issue, right? Because it's a large organization. So communication can be a problem, right? 2 is distant management. Okay, so 2 is management problems, right? So why is management an issue? So again, these 2 are the issues for diseconomies of scale, why they could take place. Obviously, there's more arguments why diseconomies of scale takes place. Here's the problem with management, right? You have a huge company, right? So obviously when I had that pizza restaurant in our made-up example from a couple lessons ago, right? So I own this pizza restaurant, right? And I have 5 employees, right? And obviously I can, as an owner, right? I love my company because this is my company. I take a lot of interest in it. So for a reason, I probably as a manager want to make sure my employees are motivated and they do a good job, because at the end of the day, if they do a good job, then my place is doing well and I can make higher profits. The goal of a firm is to make profits, right? Now imagine that, a couple decades later, I am a Pizza Hut or, a Domino's or a, Papa John's, and I have, thousands of employees, right? So me as a CEO, I cannot, I have to really make sure that I'm connected with my employees and I can motivate them, right? So management tends to be an issue because, again, these 2 things are kind of interconnected, right? So the upper management is maybe not as well connected to lower management, right? And they have those issues, right? So a lot of big companies oftentimes find problems because their employees are not being treated, I don't want to say treated well or whatnot, but the problem is there's not a direct communication link. Upper management and the lower management have huge problems, and that's one of the reasons costs start to skyrocket, right? So companies, this is a huge, problem for companies, and they try to battle it out. They use technology to fight communication. Management, you always have new styles and whatnot to make sure that management is doing a good job. Oftentimes, again, using technology and whatnot. So, we find that, efficient managers, effective leaders, along with technology, can maybe battle the side of the LRAC and make sure that costs don't take off. Okay, so this is an extremely important concept, long run average cost, because you get to see a snapshot of the way a company has been doing in terms of scale and in terms of how they can maybe grow in the future, or what are the things that they need to think about. Okay. Obviously, if you want to produce more, but you're in the diseconomies of scale, maybe you could cut back in the quantity and make higher profits, right? So these are sort of things that LRC really likes you to think about. And you should also think about. So just know about these 3 different parts of the LRAC, and you should be fine about when it comes to long run average costs. Okay, so that being said, let's move on to the new and exciting stuff. The new concept we're going to cover today is about market structure, and we're going to start off with perfect competition. Right? Perfect competition in microeconomics is an extremely important concept, right? So you think about a market structure where, we've discussed perfect competition a little bit. I'm going to explain to you guys what perfect competition is, but before I do, right, I want to draw sort of a line, and I want to show you a range of how market structure works and what kind of, in microeconomics, what are the kind of different markets we deal with. Okay, so let me go ahead and erase this, all right, so that we can draw this beautiful line of ours to show. Oops, I'm not doing well here. To show you guys the range, okay? So what are the things that you've probably heard about? You've probably heard about monopoly, right? Microsoft faced, antitrust issues because they were becoming too big. Bill Gates becoming too rich, right? Monopolies are something that people have heard about, right? De Beers is a family that has a monopoly in diamonds. There are a lot of people that have monopolies. Now, perfect competition is sort of rare to hear about. Traditionally speaking, perfect competition, you can talk about in agriculture, maybe in agriculture commodities. Perfect competition is a pretty good example there. But perfect competition, probably not heard of it. Oligopoly and the other one, you probably not heard either, but you will soon. And let me explain to you guys how this kind of works. Okay? So we have this line over here, right? And this is the kind of, this is market structure. Okay? Market. Structure. Okay? Now, I'm going to go from the most competitive to the least competitive markets. Okay? Does that make sense? So let me go ahead and start off with this side, right? So I'm going to say this is the most competitive. Competitive. Okay, there we go. So obviously this is the first one, most competitive. Probably a good guess says, okay, perfect competition, right? For those of you who don't know what that means, it's perfect competition. Probably means, if I had to guess it, says, well, there's a lot of competition, right? So this is the most competitive one, right? Perfect competition is where competition is at its max. Competition. All right. Then we have, obviously that side is most competitive. This side is least competitive, right? And again, as I told you guys before, you probably heard of monopolies. Right, so this side is monopolies. Not the game, unfortunately. This is a type of company that has no competition. They control the market, right? So there's a least competitive side of the market. That's the most competitive side. Now we've got two things in the middle in microeconomics we talk about. One is a market called oligopoly, okay? And I'm going to drop it down here so I have space to write it down. So it's oligopoly. Okay? And towards the most competitive side, there's one more thing. And this is sort of confusing in the word, but it's right here, right? So this is called monopolistic competition. All right, monopolistic competition. So we got perfect competition. So we're going from most competitive to least competitive, guys. Okay? So we start off with perfect competition over here. We have monopolistic competition. Then we have oligopoly. And finally, we have monopoly. Okay? So, we talk about 4 different, unique markets in economics, in microeconomics. Okay? And all of these are very important. And by the end of it, hopefully all of you will have a sort of a good understanding on what these individually mean. The first thing we're going to start off is with perfect competition. Okay, it's kind of like the building block of microeconomics, right? And then we'll move on to the rest of these, and we'll cover all of these. So without further ado, let's start off with perfect competition. So as I said before, when we think of perfect competition, we've talked about this before. When we talked about elasticity and things like that, we said, well, what is a perfect competition, right? We said, well, perfect competition is some, market, right, where a lot of different things happen. But one of the major important things from perfect competition sense is that no one market, or no one firm dominates the market, right? So no one firm or no consumer, one consumer, can say, hey, because I've done something, I can change market price, or I can change the supply. Okay? It's the market that dictates it. And that's why the firms in perfect competition are called price takers. A lot of information. Let me write stuff down so we can actually get it in a more concrete sense. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and erase this wonderful little line that we had drawn here. And we're going to start off with perfect competition. Perfect competition is pretty cool in some sense because in terms of, graphically speaking, in terms of, in my opinion, just giving the answers and things like that, it's pretty clear cut and laid out pretty well. So hopefully I can do a good job in explaining to you guys what perfect competition is. All right, so what is perfect competition, right? First question we have is perfect competition after I finish this. And, right, this giant question mark, what is perfect competition? So there's 4 different things that dictate perfect competition, right? So 4 different characteristics that really dictate what perfect competition really is, okay? So let's start off with the first one, right? First characteristic, I'll call this I, okay? That's 1, right? You know what, I'll just call it 1. Why should I call it I? And we'll take this 1 out, okay? So perfect competition, right? What is it? So first characteristic we said was that there are many small independent producers. Many small independent, there's that word again, independent, right? Independent producers and consumers. Producers and consumers. Okay, so many small independent producers and consumers. What does this mean? Well, we talked about it a little bit. We said one of the first things was that no one single, right? Same thing, right? I guess, I can put a slash to this because one and single probably the same thing, right? So no one single producer, just write PROD for producer and consumer, right? Can dictate market, MKT, let me short this, price. Okay, so it basically says no one person, right, or one producer can dictate what the price is, right? And that term, right, where we discuss this is called price takers, right? Producers in a perfect competition are price takers. Okay, and after I explain the 4 characteristics, I'll tell you why. But price takers basically means that as a producer, you're forced to take the price that the market is market's equilibrium's at. Okay, and we'll show that graphically too. But price takers basically means that producers, they cannot tell you what the price is. The market will tell the producer what the price is. Okay, so we said that many small producers and consumers, they're independent. No one can singly dominate and determine the price in the market. All right, so what's the second characteristic? Second characteristic in perfect competition is, and again, this is about perfect competition, and we'll go on to, I'll just erase this, and we'll work on this side of the board. Okay, again, I'll just write down perfect competition on the top here just to make sure everyone knows that I'm talking about perfect competition. And just to recap real quick, we're talking about the 4 characteristics that make perfect competition, its unique market, right? So perfect competition, right? Perfect comp. Second characteristic is, we said first characteristic was small independent producers and consumers. Second is that firms produce a standardized product, okay? So firms produce a standardized product. All right, so what does this mean? Once I finish this word standardized next year, we can talk about it. Firms produce a standardized product. Okay. What does that mean? All right, so have you guys ever, gotten milk, okay, or bread, your usual, necessities, right, like food, right? So there's not one particular brand that makes a huge difference. Yes, I might prefer a particular, brand of bread or milk, but generally speaking, one can argue that milk sort of tastes the same no matter where it's coming from, okay? Or bread, unless of course it's bad, okay? Then it tastes different. But the point is that they produce a standardized product, okay? So this means that all these firms in this market, right? Let's take the milk market, right? All the dairies and all the grocery stores that are giving you and supplying you the milk, in terms of the brands that come out, the product is not too different. Okay, the product is not too different. So one bakery, or so one bakery for bread, right? If you talk about market and bread, will not make such a different bread that a whole wheat kind of bread probably tastes the same, right? There might be different things a little bit, but for the most part, they taste the same. So the product is standardized in the market, right? So as a consumer, if I go to producer A or producer B, really doesn't make a big difference, okay? So in perfect competition, products are standardized. All right, so third characteristic is that there are no barriers to enter or exit the market. What does that mean? All right, so let's stick to this example of making bread, okay? So I've decided that in your town where you're at, I've decided that the market for a bakery, right? There's profits involved in it. So profitability is high. I think it's a good time. I'm going to enter and start my own bakery. In a perfect competition market, I, as a person who wants to start off a new company, a new firm, as we like to call it, microeconomics, I shouldn't face too many obstacles, right? So there shouldn't be too many roadblocks for me starting up a firm. Similarly, if I'm a baker and if I make milk and I decide that in your town that bread is great and I want to enter into bread, if I have to fold out of milk, and milk is a perfectly competitive market, exiting out of the market shouldn't be a big deal either. There shouldn't be big obstacles in it, right? And one of the issues that I hit here, and I want to talk about this real quick, is this word profitability, right? We've talked about this before. We've said it's one of the main important parts of it. Profitability. Okay, so why is profitability important? Profitability is what dictates people entering and exiting the market, okay? Extremely important to know, right? So if there are profits in a market like the bread market, people will enter the market because they like to make money. Remember, firms want to make money. They want to make profit, right? So they'll come into that market, in that perfectly competitive market, and suck the profit out, right? Now, if the market is making losses, that'll dictate people to leave the market because obviously people cannot bear, too much losses, right? And we'll tell you later on how these, how a firm can dictate where to shut down their company, okay? It has to do with total variable cost and total fixed cost. But, more than that, what really matters is the fact that profitability is what dictates firms to enter and exit the market. If there's profitability, if there's good profit in that market, people will enter that market, right? If there are losses, people will exit that market. Pretty intuitive, right? But important to know, okay? That being said, let's talk about the fourth one and the last one, the characteristic, okay? So fourth one, we already talked about this, but the reason I've kept this for last is that all these combined together kind of form the fourth one. And the word, again, I've talked before, are price takers, okay? So fourth one says firms are in a perfectly competitive market, right? They are, and remember this term because I promise you it'll show up on the test. Price takers, okay? Okay, so price takers, right? Firms are price takers. Why are they price takers? Well, talk about the first one. We said they're independent, they're small, and they are, they're independent and they're small, right? Producers and consumers. We talked about the fact that the second one, we said that, well, they produce a standardized product. Third one, we said that it's pretty easy to enter and exit. Okay, so what does this mean for, and why does this affect price takers? Because if one firm cannot impact a market, saying that if one firm cannot dictate the price, right? So imagine like a product like Windows, okay? So Microsoft pretty much has a monopoly, okay? Their competitor, Apple, has been doing well recently, but typically speaking, they've had a monopoly in the market, right? So if you want to use a computer, PC, generally you have Windows on it, right? So what does that mean? Windows and Microsoft, right, specifically, has the ability to dictate how much they can charge for Windows, right? They can say, you know what, no, you're not going to pay $500, you're going to pay $1,000 for us, okay? Or they can say, no, not $1,000, you can pay $900. But either way, they have the ability to dictate it. But the baker in your town, right, he cannot dictate the price of bread that well, because if he increases the price of bread, right, so imagine a loaf of bread generally costs $1, okay? He's going to make it $1.10, right? He wants to make more profit. You're not going to go back to him if it tastes the same, right? Because remember, in a perfect competition, it said it's a standardized product, right? So for the most part, they taste exactly the same. You're going to go to some other guy who charges $1. That is why firms are price takers, okay? They are forced in the market to take the price that what the market dictates, okay? They cannot tell you how much they're going to charge you because you're going to go to somewhere else. There's a lot of substitute products in that market, okay? A perfectly competitive market, there are hundreds of substitute products because there's so many different single small producers, okay? So this concept, price takers, is extremely important in knowing perfectly competitive markets. One of the examples, I talked about this before, was the agriculture commodities. That's the closest thing that people normally talk about in terms of perfectly competitive markets. You know, the reason I could take bread and milk like that, you know, things like that is because of the fact that, typically speaking, they're more perfectly competitive. To have a perfectly competitive market in reality is tough. Okay, it is, because there are a lot of variables that go on, and there are obstacles, for example, to entering and exit. It's not, there's no, you know, no barriers to entry. That's kind of, you know, on paper, it's easy to say, right? Because we have this, you know, as economists, we have this term, remember what I talked about, I said, ceteris paribus, all other things constant. Well, in life, in reality, it doesn't work that way. But for the purpose of this class in economics, when we talk about perfectly competitive markets, know these four things, okay? Know that there are single small producers. Know that there are many of them, right? Obviously. Know that on my right side, they say they produce a standardized product, right? There are no barriers to entry and exit. And lastly, they're price takers, okay? So these are the four important things. In terms of perfect competition, there's a lot more to cover. We have to go over graphs. We have to go over, you know, how they make profit. How do you decide what profit is? And you know, lots of other exciting stuff. So perfect competition is a sort of long chapter, and next lesson we're going to go over more stuff in perfect competition. So I think I've summarized, you know, these 4 points that we made about perfect competition a couple times. Remember that we went over that kind of range of market structure, right? We said perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. We're covering perfect competition for now. We're going to continue to talk about perfect competition. And hopefully along the way we can give you more examples. But you know, if you look at this lesson, the next lesson, you probably should be able to understand perfect competition way better than, you know, hopefully way better than what you had before. The homework lesson for this class, you know, typically it's for this class I've made it more theoretical. I will give you more math problems as we go on, but you know, just to recap, it's going to help out the class. The homework question is going to be, tell me the 4 characteristics of perfect competition. Okay, so you probably should be getting this by now. It should be a walk in the park. And with that, I'll see you guys in the next lesson. Thank you so much for joining me. We'll continue perfect competition in the next one. Thank you.